3 days, that is how long it took the Pacific Ocean to build its second Category 5 storm of the week. On Monday, July 27th, Hurricane Genevieve peaked at 160 miles per hour off the coast of Mexico. By Thursday, on the far side of the same ocean, Super Typhoon Dolphin had exploded from a Category 1 into the strongest storm on Earth this year, and overnight, analysts quietly revised its peak upward to 175 miles per hour. 5 storms have now reached the top of the scale in 2026. Every single one of them came out of the Pacific, and the people who track this ocean for a living say the season's most dangerous months have not even started. So what exactly is happening underneath that water, and why does it keep building monsters? One thing before we get into it: if you enjoy what we do here at Project Nightwatch, hit like and subscribe so you don't miss the next debrief, and leave a comment with where you're tuning in from tonight. Now let's break this down. Part 1. 2 Category 5s. In 3 days. The planet has produced 5 Category 5 tropical cyclones so far in 2026. All 5 of them formed in the same ocean, and the last 2 arrived 3 days apart. That is the fact this entire video hangs on, so let me say it again, slowly. Not 5 hurricanes, not 5 typhoons, 5 storms that reached the absolute top of the scale we use to measure these things. Sustained winds above 157 miles per hour, the point where the Saffir-Simpson scale simply stops counting. Every single one of them came out of the Pacific, the Atlantic, the Indian Ocean, the Southern Hemisphere basins. Combined contribution to that list this year, 0. One ocean is doing all of it. The first of the 2 storms we're covering tonight peaked early Monday morning, July 27th. Hurricane Genevieve, in the eastern Pacific, about 520 miles off the tip of Baja California, wound itself up to 160 mile per hour sustained winds and became the first Category 5 hurricane of 2026. We covered that storm 3 days ago, and at the time, the honest framing was that Genevieve was a warning shot, a harmless fish storm that happened to be a perfect measurement of what the ocean underneath it could build. Then, the ocean built another one. By Wednesday night into Thursday morning, on the far side of the Pacific, a typhoon named Dolphin finished doing something meteorologists watch for maybe once a season. It went from a Category 1 storm to a Category 5 super typhoon in somewhere between 24 and 36 hours. At its peak, the official operational estimate put its sustained winds at 165 miles per hour, wrapped around a central pressure of 910 millibars, and storm analysts are now circulating a retroactive upgrade that would push that peak even higher. We will get to that number, because it changes the record books. Dolphin is, right now, the strongest storm anywhere on Earth this year. 2 different storms, 2 different basins, 8,000 miles apart, 3 days, same ocean. Here is what a normal Pacific looks like for comparison. In the eastern Pacific, reliable satellite records going back to the early 1970s contain a grand total of 14 Category 5 hurricanes before Genevieve. That is roughly 1 every 4 years. The western Pacific runs hotter. It is the most active tropical cyclone basin on the planet in any year. But even there, a Category 5 is an event, not a routine. What the Pacific just did is produce top-of-scale storms in 2 separate basins inside the same work week, while the Atlantic, the basin Americans actually plan their summers around, has produced nothing, not a single hurricane this season. The outlook feeds are empty. That silence and this violence are not 2 separate stories. They are the same story, and by the end of this video you will see why. Because here is the thread that runs through everything tonight. The Pacific is not malfunctioning. It is running exactly the way a warming, El Niño-charged Pacific is supposed to run, and it just demonstrated twice in 3 days what that machine can manufacture. The storms are the output, the engine is the ocean, and the engine is the part the experts in our title are actually worried about. I want to be precise about that word, worried, because it is doing specific work here. Nobody credible is worried that Dolphin hits a major city this week. As of tonight, it threatens no one. It is spinning over open water south of a tiny American outpost called Wake Island, headed west-northwest into more open water. Genevieve is already weakening, 735 miles from the nearest coastline, sending nothing ashore but surf. If your only question is who gets hit tomorrow, the answer is nobody, and you can sleep fine. The worry is about capability. This July, the Pacific demonstrated that it can build a top-of-scale storm in the east, build another in the west, do both at explosive speed, and do one of them in a location where storms this strong have never been recorded forming before. Every coastline downstream of that ocean, Japan, the Philippines, Mexico, Hawaii, the entire Pacific Rim, plans its defenses against a historical playbook. This season is quietly rewriting that playbook, page by page, and the people whose job is to forecast these storms are watching it happen in real time. It helps to see the week laid out as a timeline, because the compression is the point. On Saturday, July 25th, Genevieve was a Category 1 hurricane with 80-mile-per-hour winds, unremarkable in every way. Through Sunday it climbed, hour over hour, at a pace that made forecasters double-check their own numbers. By around 2 in the morning, Monday, July 27th, it was a Category 5. That same Monday, on the opposite side of the ocean, the system-designated 12W was consolidating into a typhoon and being given the name Dolphin. Tuesday, Dolphin organised. Wednesday, it detonated, Category 1 to the top of the scale in roughly a day and a half. By Thursday morning, July 30th, the Pacific had its second top-of-scale storm of the week, and Genevieve, its first, was already spinning down over cooler water. At no point in that 6-day window was the Pacific without a violent storm either at Category 5 or racing toward it. The ocean did not produce two events. It ran a continuous production line. A quick note on words because the vocabulary hides the connection. Genevieve is called a hurricane. Dolphin is called a typhoon. They are the same phenomenon, a tropical cyclone, a rotating heat engine built on warm water, and the different names are pure geography. East of the date line in the Atlantic and Eastern Pacific, we say hurricane. West of the date line, we say typhoon. The phrase super typhoon is a threshold used for Western Pacific storms whose sustained winds reach 150 miles per hour. Itself a reminder that the Western Pacific needed an extra tier above the ordinary scale, because its storms kept outgrowing the vocabulary. When you strip the labels away, what the Pacific produced this week was two of the same machine, at maximum output, in two different rooms of the same building. And it is worth walking the scale those machines climbed, because the categories are not evenly spaced. They measure destruction, and destruction compounds. A Category 1 hurricane, at 74 to 95 miles per hour, peels shingles and snaps tree limbs. Category 3, the threshold for a so-called major hurricane at 111 miles per hour, removes roofs and makes neighborhoods uninhabitable for weeks. By Category 4, well-built homes lose walls, and Category 5, 157 miles per hour and up with no upper bound, is the tier where the scale's own authors essentially stop distinguishing, because the outcome converges: total roof failure, structural collapse, areas uninhabitable for months. The energy carried by wind rises with the square of its speed, which means a storm at 165 is not modestly worse than a storm at 120. It is carrying roughly double the destructive force per square foot of anything standing in its way. Both of this week's storms lived at the top of that curve. Meanwhile, the Atlantic silence deserves one more beat, because the contrast is so stark it almost reads as a misprint. As of this week, the National Hurricane Center's Atlantic outlook shows nothing. No active systems, no formation expected, in late July. The basin that produces the storms with the household names, the one that coastal America boards up for, is running empty while the Pacific runs a surplus so large it accounts for every top-tier storm on the planet this year. When one side of the world's largest ocean system goes quiet at the exact moment the other side goes feral, that is not coincidence. That is a single lever being pulled somewhere underneath both of them, and finding that lever is where this video is headed. So tonight's debrief runs in 4 movements. First, the storm itself, how Dolphin exploded, what the numbers mean, and the peculiar record it just set. Then the twin, Genevieve, and what it means that these two happened back to back. Then the engine, the El Niño that flipped on in under a year, and the deeper reservoir of ocean heat that has now broken its own record 9 years running. And finally the stakes, where Dolphin's stored power might actually get spent, and why the professionals' version of worry looks nothing like the internet's version. Name the 5, briefly, because the roll call makes the point better than any adjective. Super Typhoon Sinlaku opened the year's account in April, battering Saipan and Tinian in the Mariana Islands. Super Typhoon Bavi followed, peaking near 180 miles per hour as it menaced Rota, the third Category 5 of the year, and, at the time, the season's high water mark. Then came this week's pair, Genevieve, the first Category 5 hurricane of 2026, and the first in the Eastern Pacific since Christie in October of 2024, and now Dolphin, the strongest of them all. 5 machines at maximum output, 1 ocean, and a season that by historical rhythm is only now entering its most productive months. Keep that roll call in your head. We will come back to it, because laid end to end those 5 storms draw a shape, and the shape points somewhere. A quick word on how this channel handles a story like this one. Storms in progress are moving targets. Positions shift every 6 hours. Intensities get revised, as you're about to see, sometimes revised upward after the fact. And forecast tracks are probability fans, not promises. Everything in tonight's debrief is current as of July 30th, and where a number is provisional or a claim is circulating ahead of official confirmation, I will flag it in exactly those words. The story does not need inflating. Told with the qualifiers intact, it is alarming enough. One more thing before we go deeper, because it is the detail that made me stop scrolling this morning. Late last night, the storm trackers who live inside this data started reporting that Dolphin's peak intensity had been retroactively revised upward, not by a little. If the revision holds in the official record, Dolphin becomes the 3rd Pacific storm this year to cross a threshold that most full seasons never see crossed once, and it is still July. But the strangest thing about Super Typhoon Dolphin is not how strong it became, it is where. Part 2. The explosion. Nobody watched. Happen. Rewind the clock about 4 days, and Dolphin was nothing special. It carried the designation 12W, the 12th tropical system of the Western Pacific season, and it was a typhoon, respectable but ordinary, churning across open water thousands of miles southeast of Japan. The kind of storm the agencies log, the shipping lanes route around, and almost nobody else ever hears about. Then, over a window that lasted somewhere between 24 and 36 hours, it detonated. The formal definition of rapid intensification, the benchmark forecasters use, is an increase in sustained winds of about 35 miles per hour within 24 hours. That number exists because it marks the edge of what forecast models handle well. Beyond it, storms are outrunning the physics the models resolve. Dolphin did not clear that bar. It lapped it. Going from Category 1 strength to Category 5 strength means adding roughly 75 miles per hour or more of sustained wind, and Dolphin packed that entire climb into a day and a half at most. Some reconstructions of the satellite data suggest the steepest part of the climb was even more compressed than that. It is worth pausing on how we even know this, because the answer surprises people. There are no Hurricane Hunter aircraft in the Western Pacific. The United States stopped flying routine reconnaissance into typhoons in 1987, which means every intensity estimate for a storm like Dolphin comes from satellites, primarily through a method called the Dvorak technique, where trained analysts read the storm's cloud patterns like a radiologist reads an X-ray. The shape of the eye, the temperature of the cloud tops, the symmetry of the bands, each configuration maps to an intensity number. It is remarkably good. It is also an estimate made from 200 miles above the ocean of winds no instrument is directly measuring. Hold that thought, because it becomes important later when we talk about the upgrade. What the satellites showed during those 36 hours was a storm assembling itself into something close to textbook perfection. Early frames show a sprawling, slightly ragged mass of convection. Powerful, but disorganized. Energy spread wide. Then the structure begins to tighten. A central, dense, overcast forms, a smooth shield of cold cloud tops hiding the core. And then, in the space of a few frames, an eye punches through. Small, sharply defined, warm at its center, ringed by a wall of the most violent convection on the planet. One analyst described the transition as the storm going from a disorganized cloud mass to a pinhole-eyed buzzsaw in a matter of hours. Warm eye, cold ring, near-perfect symmetry. When forecasters see that signature, they stop asking whether a storm will strengthen and start asking where it will stop. The ingredients underneath it explain the speed. Sea surface temperatures along Dolphin's path were running near 30 degrees Celsius. Several degrees above the commonly cited floor, a tropical cyclone needs just to sustain itself. Wind shear, the difference in winds between the lower and upper atmosphere that tilts and tears storms apart, was minimal. The mid-levels of the atmosphere were moist, so dry air never got a chance to choke the core, and the storm's own geometry helped it. Dolphin built a compact core, and compact cores intensify fast for the same reason a figure skater spins faster when she pulls her arms in. Conservation of angular momentum rewards small, tight circulations. Everything that could align, aligned. There is one more detail from those frames that matters. Much of the steepest intensification happened overnight, local time, which is common actually because tropical cyclones often strengthen after dark when the cloud tops cool and the storm's internal heat engine runs more efficiently against the colder background. But it means this particular explosion happened over one of the emptier stretches of ocean on Earth, in the dark, witnessed by nothing but satellites and a handful of analysts on the night shift. No cameras, no coastline, no one to point a phone at the sky. The strongest storm of the year assembled itself in near-total privacy. By Thursday morning local time, the assembly was finished. Sustained winds operationally estimated at 165 miles per hour. Central pressure, 910 millibars. To translate that second number, the average sea level pressure on this planet is about 1,013 millibars. Dolphin had carved more than 100 millibars out of the atmosphere at its centre, a hole in the sky deep enough that the ocean surface beneath it physically bulges upward, drawn into the vacuum. Barometric pressure that low belongs to a small club. Most decades produce only a handful of storms that reach it, and here is the beat that should genuinely bother you. This was the second time in the same week that a Pacific storm had blown past the rapid intensification benchmark by a multiple. Genevieve, on the other side of the ocean, had just added roughly 80 miles per hour of wind speed in about 30 hours, more than double the qualifying rate for rapid intensification, sustained across more than one measurement window. 2 basins, 2 storms, the same violent acceleration profile days apart. A benchmark that was designed to flag the rare outlier got cleared twice in 1 week, like it was a formality. The Dvorak method deserves one more minute, because the entire story of this storm's measurement runs through it. The technique assigns what analysts call a T-number, a rating from 1 to 8 that maps cloud pattern to intensity. A tropical storm with a curved band of convection might rate a T3. A well-formed eye surrounded by cold cloud tops pushes into the T6 range. The top of the scale, T8, corresponds to winds around 170 knots and is almost never awarded. It is the technique saying, in effect, this is the strongest configuration the method recognizes. During Dolphin's explosive window, analysts watching the infrared imagery saw the storm climbing that ladder at a pace the scale's designers treated as near the physical limit of how fast a cyclone can reorganize. Independent automated estimates, which run the same logic without human conservatism, briefly flash numbers at the very top of the range. When the machines and the humans disagree, the humans usually publish the cautious number. Remember that when we get to the upgrade. Why do forecast models struggle so badly with this specific behavior? The honest answer is resolution. Rapid intensification lives in the storm's inner core, in the structure of the eye wall, in convective bursts a few miles across, in the way individual towers of thunderstorm punch into the stratosphere and concentrate the storm's heating. Global forecast models divide the atmosphere into grid boxes many miles wide. The processes that decide whether a storm gains 80 miles per hour in a day happen inside a single box. Specialized hurricane models do better, and they have improved measurably in the last decade, but the basic asymmetry remains. Track forecasting has gotten dramatically more accurate over 30 years, while intensity forecasting, especially the violent nonlinear jumps, has lagged behind. Every forecaster knows the failure mode. The storm that reads as a Category 2 at the evening briefing and greets the morning as a Category 5 is the scenario the entire profession trains against, and it is exactly the profile both of this week's storms displayed over open water. The overnight timing was not incidental either, and the mechanism is worth 30 seconds. A tropical cyclone is a heat engine, and like any heat engine, its power output depends on the temperature difference between its warm intake, the ocean surface, and its cold exhaust, the cloud tops at the top of the troposphere. After sunset, the upper atmosphere cools while the ocean, with its enormous thermal inertia, stays warm. The temperature gap widens, the engine's theoretical maximum output climbs. Analysts have watched for decades as storms time their most violent deepening to the small hours, and Dolphin followed the pattern faithfully. The frames where the eye cleared and the pressure fell fastest came in darkness. Over water no ship was crossing, at the hour when even the storm-tracking hobbyist community was mostly asleep. The Pacific built the year's strongest storm on the night shift, and for the pattern-minded viewer, The scarcity math is the detail to hold. Intensification runs of this magnitude, the full climb from the bottom of the hurricane scale to the top inside 36 hours, are rare enough that individual cases become reference points meteorologists cite for years afterward. Most seasons produce none. The historical cases that did it over open water became case studies. The ones that did it near a coastline became disasters with names people still recognize. The 2026 Pacific has now produced 2 such climbs in a single week, one per basin, as if the ocean were demonstrating the maneuver on both sides at once for anyone who doubted the first performance. The satellites logged all of it. NASA's event tracking system recorded Dolphin at 140 knots as of 6 in the morning Universal Time on July 30th. Its own conservative snapshot of a storm other agencies were assessing even higher. The numbers were extraordinary on their face. Then, overnight, the analysts went back through the data and decided the storm had actually been stronger than anyone said out loud. Part 3. 175. The report started circulating early this morning. Super Typhoon. Dolphin's peak intensity from the night before had been retroactively upgraded to 175 miles per hour, 280 kilometers per hour, with that same central pressure of 910 millibars. Before we go one sentence further, the honesty caveat this channel owes you, as of tonight, July 30th, that 175 figure is a reported revision circulating from storm trackers who follow the agency data closely. It is not yet something you can look up in a finalized official best track file, because those files get assembled and reassembled over weeks and months. Treat the number the way we treat it here, as reported, credible, and provisional. The operational estimate, the 165, is the anchor. The revision is the signal. But it is worth understanding why revisions like this happen at all, because the mechanism tells you something reassuring and unsettling at the same time. Remember, no aircraft fly into these storms. Every intensity number is a satellite estimate, produced in real time, under deadline, from cloud patterns. After the fact, analysts get luxuries the operational desk never has. More satellite passes, microwave imagery that sees through the cloud shield to the actual structure of the eyewall, scatterometer data on the surface wind field, time to compare notes. Sometimes the reanalysis marks a storm down. Sometimes, as reported here, it concludes the real-time desk was too conservative, and the storm at its peak was a category of violence beyond what anyone published while it was happening. Sit with that version of events for a second. At the moment of Dolphin's peak, the strongest storm on Earth this year was even stronger than the people whose full-time job is measuring it believed in real time. The instruments did not miss it. The method just runs cautious, and the truth caught up a day later. Now for what the number means if it stands. 175 miles per hour of sustained wind is not a gust. It is the average, held minute after minute. The strongest tornadoes on Earth, the ones that erase neighborhoods in Oklahoma, produce comparable winds across a damage path a few hundred yards wide for a few minutes. Dolphin was producing them around an eyewall miles across, hour after hour, and the machine kept running like that through the night. Gust estimates circulating alongside the upgrade run higher still. Some forecast claims have peak gusts near 220 miles per hour in the storm's next intensification window. Those are forecasts, not observations, and we label them as such. But even the confirmed floor of this storm is a category of wind that human construction is simply not rated for, and the pressure deserves its own translation. 910 millibars puts Dolphin deeper than all but a handful of storms in any given decade, in any basin. For context on where the absolute ceiling sits, the strongest tropical cyclone ever reliably measured in the Western Hemisphere, Hurricane Patricia, in 2015, a storm we talked about in our video from July 27th, bottomed out at 872 millibars with 215 mile-per-hour winds. Dolphin is not Patricia, but it is closer to Patricia than it is to an ordinary major hurricane, and it got there in a day and a half. Here is the ledger line that turns one impressive storm into a pattern. If the 175 upgrade holds, Dolphin becomes the third storm in the Pacific this year to reach or exceed 175 mile-per-hour sustained winds. Third, most entire seasons in most eras do not produce one storm at that level. The 2026 Pacific has now reportedly produced 3, and the calendar on the wall still says July. The Western Pacific season does not even reach its historical peak until late August through October. By the standard rhythm of these seasons, the most dangerous months have not started yet. The energy accounting behind all this is almost absurd to say out loud. A mature tropical cyclone at this intensity releases heat energy at a rate hundreds of times larger than the entire electrical generating capacity of human civilization. All of it harvested from one source: warm seawater, evaporating, rising, condensing, and dumping its heat into the storm's engine. Numbers like 175 are not really wind measurements. They are readouts on how much fuel the ocean was able to deliver and how efficiently the machine burned it. There is a second layer of measurement nuance worth knowing, because it explains why different agencies will publish different peak numbers for the same storm and why none of them are lying. American practice, the Joint Typhoon Warning Center, the National Hurricane Center, measures sustained wind as a 1-minute average. The Japan Meteorological Agency, the official warning authority for the Western Pacific, uses a 10-minute average, which smooths the gusts down and produces systematically lower figures for identical storms. A storm reported at 175 miles per hour on the 1-minute standard might carry an official 10-minute figure dramatically lower, and both are correct within their own systems. So when you see conflicting numbers for Dolphin over the coming days, and you will, the disagreement is mostly arithmetic, not analysis. The 1-minute figures are the ones this video uses throughout, because they are the standard the historical comparisons are built on. The best track process itself is worth demystifying, since tonight's whole controversy lives inside it. During a storm's life, agencies publish operational estimates every 6 hours, their best real-time judgment, made under deadline. Afterward, sometimes weeks or months afterward, analysts rebuild the storm's entire history from every scrap of data, each satellite pass, each microwave overpass that X-rayed the eyewall structure, each scatterometer sweep of the surface winds, ship reports, buoy traces, everything. The rebuilt history, the best track, becomes the storm's official biography, the version that enters the climate record. Revisions of 10 miles per hour or more between the operational and final numbers are routine. The reported upgrade to 175 is exactly this machinery working as designed. Not a correction of an error, but the difference between a snapshot judged in real time and a portrait assembled with all the evidence. And to make the wind number physical rather than abstract. The force wind exerts on a structure scales with the square of its speed. Take a well-built coastal home rated optimistically for winds around 120 miles per hour. At 175, the load on its walls is more than double what it was engineered to survive, not 20% worse, more than 100% worse. This is why the damage descriptions at the top of the scale stop bothering with nuance. Beyond a certain wind load, engineering distinctions between well-built and poorly built stop mattering, because the atmosphere is applying forces outside the design envelope of civilian construction entirely. The pressure side is just as physical. A gradient this steep, over 100 millibars of difference across a couple hundred miles, is the atmospheric equivalent of a dam holding back a reservoir, and wind is simply the water finding its way downhill. The deeper the hole, the steeper the hill, the faster the flow. 910 millibars is a very, very deep hole, which is exactly why the exact figure, 165, 175, matters less than what the revision represents. The trend line is the story. The measuring system keeps having to adjust upward. The benchmarks keep getting lapped. The rare thresholds keep getting crossed early, and often, and in bunches. And in Dolphin's case, one threshold got crossed that has nothing to do with wind speed at all. To see it, you have to look at a map, because this storm reached the top of the scale in a part of the ocean where, according to the record books, that is not supposed to be possible. Part 4. The storm at the edge of the map. Every basin has a geography of violence, a zone where its strongest storms are born and a zone where they mature. In the Western Pacific, that geography has been stable for as long as we have kept records. Storms are typically seeded far to the east, in the deep tropics near the Marshall Islands, as loose clusters of thunderstorms riding the trade winds. Then they march west, across thousands of miles of progressively warmer, deeper, more storm-nourishing water, and they do their explosive growing in the neighborhood of the Philippine Sea, the warm pool, the deepest reservoir of tropical ocean heat on the planet, the factory floor where names like Tip and Haiyan and Hagibis earned their places in the record books. East is the nursery, west is the forge, that is the playbook. Dolphin ignored it. Dolphin reached super typhoon intensity, reportedly the full 175, way out east, south and west of Wake Island, in the open ocean near the international date line. Meteorologists tracking it have described it as the strongest typhoon on record to develop so close to the date line, which makes it one of the easternmost Category 5 typhoons ever observed. To put that plainly, in the region of the Pacific where Dolphin exploded, the historical record contains no storm of this strength doing what Dolphin just did. The forge is not supposed to be there. The water that Far East is not supposed to be able to support this. It was, and it did. Hold on to the question of why, because the answer is coming in the second half of this video, and it is the single most important connection tonight. A record like this is not trivia. It is evidence. Something moved the factory, but first, the island. Because there is one speck of American soil in that entire quadrant of ocean, and Dolphin passed close to it. Wake Island is a coral atoll about 2,300 miles west of Honolulu. 3 square miles of land, a lagoon, an airstrip, and not much else. It is a United States territory, administered by the Air Force, hosting a small rotating population of military personnel and contractors, usually numbering in the dozens to low hundreds. It exists functionally because of that airstrip, a refueling and emergency landing point in a stretch of the Pacific where the alternatives are seawater in every direction for 1,000 miles. It has a history far heavier than its size. It was the site of one of the opening battles of the Pacific War in 1941, and today it is one of the loneliest postings in the American military. By the tracker estimates, Dolphin's core passed roughly 320 kilometers, about 200 miles, to the south and west of that atoll, moving west-northwest at about 10 knots. 200 miles sounds comfortable. On the scale of a super typhoon, it is not comfortable. It is a near miss. A storm like Dolphin generates damaging winds well over 100 miles from its center and swells that propagate across entire ocean basins. A wobble in the track, the kind of wobble eyewall replacement cycles routinely produce, and we will talk about those shortly. And the strongest storm on Earth this year is bearing down on a flat coral runway that sits at its highest natural point about 20 feet above the sea. This is what the phrase no land threat actually means in the remote Pacific, and it is worth being honest about it. It does not mean the storm is safely away from everything. It means the only things in range are small enough and remote enough that they do not register in headlines. For the people on that atoll watching a Category 5 slide past 200 miles away, the margin between a quiet week and a catastrophe was a steering current. Luck, measured in tens of miles. The agencies watched the whole passage from orbit. NASA's Earth-observing event system logged Dolphin at 140 knots on its morning update, one of several eyes tracking a storm that no aircraft will ever fly into, and no surface station will ever measure directly. Out there, at the edge of the map, the entire apparatus of human storm monitoring reduces to satellites, physics, and trained judgment. It is a strange fact of the modern world. We can watch a record-breaking storm in real time from space, in beautiful resolution, and still, as last night's upgrade proved, only find out afterward exactly how strong it really was. Consider the logistics of that exposure for a moment, because they are unlike anywhere else American lives are stationed. Wake has no harbour for large vessels and no permanent civilian population. Everything and everyone arrives and leaves by air on the strength of one runway. If a storm commits to the atoll, the response is not sheltering in place. There is no high ground, no inland, no second island to retreat to. The response is evacuation by aircraft, flown on a deadline set by the storm's outer wind field, because once crosswinds exceed operating limits, the runway closes and the option expires. Contingency planning for the island has always treated typhoons as the primary natural threat for exactly this reason. The people stationed there this week did what the procedure calls for. They watched the forecast track, watched the error cone, and calculated how many hours of runway they had left if the wobble went the wrong way. The wobble went the right way. This time the margin held and the atoll got wave action and gusty squalls instead of the eye wall. The history under that runway makes the near-miss land differently. Wake was where America's Pacific War began in earnest. Attacked within hours of Pearl Harbor in December 1941, defended for 2 weeks by a garrison of a few hundred, occupied for the rest of the war. The island has been a refueling stop, a missile test support site, and a fallback airfield ever since. It has survived shell fire and occupation and 70 years of storms. It remains what it always was, 3 square miles of coral in an ocean that produces the most violent storms on the planet, defensible against nearly everything except the weather. Now put the record in its statistical frame. Typhoon climatology near the dateline is thin by design. The historical record out there is a record of storms in their infancy, tropical depressions and storms still assembling, saving their violence for the western half of the basin. Category 5. Intensity that far east is not merely uncommon. The analysts who track basin records describe Dolphin as the strongest typhoon ever recorded, developing that close to the line. When a dataset that spans decades of satellite coverage produces a no-precedent event, there are only two explanations. Either the dice finally landed on a face they had never landed on before, possible, dice do that, or something changed about the table. One anomalous storm is an anecdote, but an anomalous storm in the same July as a record-early Category 5 ledger, back-to-back top-of-scale events, and an ocean-posting record heat. That is the table changing. Hold that thought 2 more parts. Even from 200 miles, Dolphin will not leave the region untouched, because storms this large export their energy across entire basins. The swell radiating outward from that eye wall travels for thousands of miles, arriving days later on coastlines that never see a cloud from the storm itself. The same mechanism currently sending Genevieve's surf onto California beaches from 700 miles out. Mariners in the North and Central Pacific will be routing around Dolphin's wave field for a week. A super typhoon is never really a local event. It is a basin-wide broadcast, transmitted through the water, and as the satellites watched through Thursday, Dolphin began doing something that, on the intensity charts, looks like good news. The winds eased off the peak, the pressure ticked upward. A casual read says the monster is winding down. It is not winding down. It is reloading. And the way it reloads is one of the most remarkable mechanisms in atmospheric science. Part 5. The eye wall that tears itself down to rebuild. To understand what Dolphin is doing right now, you need to understand the strangest maintenance ritual in atmospheric science, the eye wall replacement cycle. It is the reason the intensity chart of a great typhoon looks less like a mountain with one peak and more like a range with several. And it is the reason the apparent weakening on today's charts should not comfort anyone downstream. Here is the mechanism, step by step. At the heart of a storm like Dolphin sits the eye wall, a ring of thunderstorms perhaps 10 to 30 miles across, the most violent real estate on the planet where the storm's fastest winds live. As a cyclone reaches extreme intensity, something curious happens in the rain bands spiraling outside that ring. They begin to organize. A second ring of thunderstorms forms, concentric to the first, perhaps 50 or 60 miles out. Between the two rings, a moat of sinking, drying air opens up, and then the outer ring does something almost predatory. It intercepts the inflow. The warm, moist air spiraling in from the ocean surface, the fuel line, gets consumed by the outer eye wall before it can reach the inner one. Starved, the original eye wall weakens, wobbles, and collapses. The outer ring then contracts inward, tightens, and becomes the new eye wall. The storm has replaced its own engine core while running. While the swap is underway, the storm's peak winds typically drop, often by 20 or 30 knots, and the pressure rises. On a chart it looks like decline. Then the new eye wall finishes contracting, the fuel line reconnects, and if the ocean underneath is still warm, the storm re-intensifies, sometimes right back to where it was, sometimes beyond. Dolphin has already run this cycle at least once. The satellite signatures were unambiguous, cloud top warming around the core, the eye going cloud-filled and indistinct, the concentric ring structure showing on microwave imagery. And as of the most recent analyses circulating today, the storm appears to have completed another replacement successfully, and the analysts who read these patterns for a living are now openly discussing whether Dolphin is beginning a run at a third intensity peak. The core that emerged from the latest cycle is compact. The water ahead of it is just as favourable as the water behind. Nothing in the storm's environment has told it to stop. Sit with what that means. This is not a storm that peaked once and is now fading. This is a storm cycling at the top of the scale, peak, rebuild, re-peak, like a weightlifter resting between sets. Each apparent weakening on the chart is the rest between lifts, not the end of the workout. Forecast models, for their part, show yet another eye wall replacement cycle, likely within the next 12 to 24 hours, which would impose another temporary dip. And circulating forecast claims, unofficial and we label them as such, suggest that if the current re-intensification completes before that next cycle begins, Dolphin could reach a new peak around 185 miles per hour on Friday, with gusts approaching 220. Official guidance has been more conservative, on the order of 170. Either number would keep Dolphin the strongest storm on Earth this year by a widening margin. There is a second consequence of eyewall replacement that matters even more for what comes later in this story, and it is the one casual coverage always misses. Each time a storm trades its small inner eyewall for a larger outer one, its wind field broadens. The maximum wind at the centre may dip, but the area covered by damaging winds grows. The storm gets physically bigger. A cyclone that runs several replacement cycles over several days tends to arrive at the end of its journey not as a small sharp dart, but as a sprawling engine hundreds of miles across, pushing a vastly larger volume of ocean ahead of it. If that storm eventually approaches land, the broadened wind field translates directly into more coastline under hurricane-force winds and a larger storm surge. Every cycle Dolphin runs out here over open water is potentially a size upgrade for whatever it becomes next week. There is a structural irony in Dolphin's specific anatomy worth adding. The very feature that let it intensify so explosively is the feature that guarantees these cycles keep coming. Small eyes are fast eyes, the skater with her arms pulled in, but small eyes are also unstable eyes. The tighter the ring of maximum winds, the more prone it becomes to exactly the outer ring insurgency we just walked through. In the analyst's experience, a pinhole-eyed storm at extreme intensity is not a stable configuration but a temporary one, almost always resolved by replacement. A minority of storms escape the treadmill by reorganizing into what meteorologists call an annular structure, a single, huge, donut eye with the rain band stripped away. And those storms become eerily steady, holding intensity for days. Dolphin has shown no sign of settling into that mode. It remains in the volatile regime, compact, violent, and structurally committed to tearing itself down and rebuilding for as long as the fuel holds out. For forecasters, replacement cycles are one of the last great timing problems in the field. They can see one coming. The microwave imagery gives a day or so of warning, but predicting exactly when it starts, how long it lasts, and how completely the storm recovers remains genuinely hard. Over the open ocean, that uncertainty costs nothing. Near a coastline, it is everything. The difference between a storm that arrives mid-cycle, dishevelled and a category weaker, and one that arrives freshly rebuilt at maximum output. Some of the worst forecast surprises in modern typhoon history have been exactly this. A storm timing its rebuild to finish just before landfall, which is one more reason the professionals watching Dolphin keep their eyes on the calendar as much as the intensity chart. The storm has days of warm water ahead of it, and every one of those days is another opportunity to run the cycle again. History offers grim illustrations of why this size mechanism matters, and one is burned into American memory. In August of 2005, Hurricane Katrina ran an eyewall replacement cycle in the Gulf of Mexico shortly before landfall. The cycle actually reduced her peak winds. She came ashore weaker, on paper, than she had been the day before. But the replacement had swollen her wind field enormously, and it was that broadened engine, pushing a mound of Gulf water ahead of it across a shallow shelf, that generated the catastrophic surge. The chart said weakening. The coastline experienced the opposite. Forecasters have carried that lesson ever since. With great storms, the question is never just how strong, but how big. An eyewall replacement is the mechanism that trades one for the other. The tools for watching the cycle deserve a mention too, because they are the only reason we can narrate Dolphin's internal life at all. Standard infrared satellite imagery sees the storm's roof, the cold cloud tops, and a replacement cycle mostly hides beneath that roof. The view that matters comes from polar orbiting satellites carrying microwave sounders, which see through the upper cloud deck to the rain structure below, revealing the concentric rings like an ultrasound revealing a second heartbeat. Those passes are intermittent. A given storm might get imaged a handful of times a day, so analysts assemble the storm's inner history from snapshots, inferring the phase of the cycle between frames. When the next microwave pass over Dolphin comes in, it will answer the question everyone tracking this storm is asking tonight. Is the third peak already underway, or is the next moat already forming? And notice what is actually powering this loop, because it is the thread of this whole video wearing a different costume. The eyewall replacement cycle is only a re-intensification story if the ocean underneath keeps delivering fuel. Cold water would end it. The storm would rebuild onto an empty tank and spin down, the way Genevieve is spinning down right now over the cooler waters west of Baja. Dolphin cycles keep completing because the warm layer beneath it keeps being there, mile after mile, day after day, further east than that kind of fuel supply has any historical business being. The rebuilds are not the remarkable part. The refueling is. Which brings us finally back around to the other side of the ocean, because to understand why the experts see a pattern and not a coincidence, you have to look at the storm that came first. The Twin. Part 6. The Twin. On the other side. 3 days before Dolphin's detonation, the Eastern Pacific staged a dress rehearsal so similar it borders on eerie. If you saw our video from July 27th, you know this storm, but its role in tonight's story is different, so stay with me even if you remember the details. 3 days ago, Genevieve was the story. Tonight, Genevieve is evidence. The timeline compressed. On the evening of Saturday, July 25th, Hurricane Genevieve was a Category 1 storm with sustained winds around 80 miles per hour, several hundred miles off the Mexican coast. Nothing about it demanded attention. 30 hours later, in the small hours of Monday, July 27th, it was a Category 5 with winds around 160 miles per hour and a central pressure near 929 millibars. It had doubled its wind speed in roughly 30 hours. The official threshold for rapid intensification, remember, is 35 miles per hour of gain in 24. Genevieve gained roughly 80, more than double the qualifying rate, sustained across more than one measurement window. That performance made Genevieve the first Category 5 hurricane of 2026 anywhere on Earth, and the first in the Eastern Pacific Basin since Hurricane Christy in October of 2024. In a basin whose entire satellite-era record contains only 14 storms at that level, Genevieve became the 15th, and held the title of the planet's strongest storm of the year for less than 72 hours before the Western Pacific took it away. Where is she now? Fading, gracefully, exactly the way a fish storm should. As of today, July 30th, Genevieve has dropped to Category 2 strength. Sustained winds near 100 miles per hour, centered about 735 miles west-southwest of the southern tip of Baja California, trundling west-northwest at 9 miles per hour into the open Pacific. The weakening had help. Genevieve ran an eyewall replacement cycle of her own shortly after peaking, and unlike Dolphin, she rebuilt onto progressively cooler water. The fuel line thinned. The rebuilt engine never got back to full output. That contrast, same maneuver, opposite outcome, decided entirely by the temperature of the water underneath, is as clean a demonstration as you will ever get of what actually governs these machines. No coastline will ever record hurricane-force winds from Genevieve, and yet she is not leaving the human world entirely untouched, because a Category 5 does not need to arrive to reach you. The enormous swell generated at her peak has been radiating outward for days, and it is arriving now, on the beaches of southern Baja, southwest Mexico and southern California, as towering surf and rip currents that forecasters have been flagging as dangerous and potentially deadly through the weekend. Lifeguards a continent's width from the storm's eye are working rescues generated by winds that blew themselves out days ago, 700 miles offshore. The storm touches land without ever coming to land. Keep that mechanism in mind. Dolphin is currently broadcasting the same energy across the western half of the ocean. The peak day portrait is worth rehanging on the wall for a moment, because tonight it doubles as a specification sheet for what this ocean can build on demand. At maximum, Genevieve carried her 160 mile per hour winds around a center about 520 miles south-southwest of Baja California, with a central pressure near 929 millibars and hurricane-force winds extending well away from the eye. The water she crossed during the climb was reported at 86 to 94 degrees Fahrenheit. Remember, the commonly cited minimum for a tropical cyclone merely to sustain itself is about 80 degrees. She was not scraping by on adequate fuel. She was running on water so far above the threshold that the intensification models, fed those temperatures, kept signaling more headroom above whatever intensity she had already reached. The night she peaked, forecasters noted the only thing likely to stop her was the storm's own internal restructuring, and that is precisely what happened. An eyewall replacement beginning within hours of peak, right on schedule for a cyclone at the top of the scale. There is also a footnote from that same week that completes the picture of an ocean in overdrive. Genevieve was not even alone in her own basin. As she peaked, a second hurricane, Fausto, was spinning several hundred miles east of Hawaii, and the two storms briefly shared the eastern and central Pacific the way Dolphin and Genevieve now bracket the whole ocean. Fausto has since weakened to a tropical storm near the islands, more nuisance than threat, but count the machinery running simultaneously this week and the tally is remarkable. A super typhoon at historic intensity in the west, a Category 5 survivor winding down in the east, a weakening tropical storm near Hawaii in the middle, and swell from all of it crisscrossing the basin like ripples in a pond that will not settle. The Pacific is not producing isolated events, it is fully subscribed, and the surf deserves one more layer of mechanism, because it is the only way most people will ever physically feel these storms. The waves arriving on California and Baja beaches this weekend are not ordinary wind chop, they are long-period swell, energy injected into the ocean surface by sustained hurricane-force winds, organised into waves that travel at tens of miles per hour and lose remarkably little energy over distance. A wave train with a period of 18 or 20 seconds carries far more water and far more force than its size in the lineup suggests. It surges further up the beach, digs harder at sandbars, and generates the rip currents that account for most surf zone rescues and fatalities. Lifeguard services from Baja to Los Angeles County flagged exactly this profile through the weekend. If you are near those beaches, the storm is 700 miles away and it is still able to reach you. That asymmetry, spectacular violence exporting quiet danger across an entire ocean, is the signature of this whole season. It is worth saying plainly what our July 27th video argued, because this week graded the argument. The claim was that Genevieve herself was almost beside the point, that a harmless fish storm doubling its winds in 30 hours was best understood as a clean measurement of the ocean's current capability, and that the measurement, not the storm, was the warning. That framing was a forecast of a kind. 3 days later, the same ocean built a second storm, stronger, faster, further east than any on record, and the measurement repeated itself on the other side of the basin. Even Genevieve's tidal lineage carries the signal. The previous Eastern Pacific Category 5, Christie, peaked in late October of 2024, at the tail of its season, where such storms historically belong. Genevieve reached the same tier in July, months ahead of the basin's usual schedule for its stronger storms. The machines are not only stronger, they are early. Now hold the two storms side by side, because the symmetry is the point of this entire part. Two tropical cyclones in two different basins, separated by 8,000 miles of ocean and 3 days on the calendar. Both began as unremarkable Category 1s. Both detonated, one gaining 80 miles per hour in 30 hours, the other climbing 4 full categories in at most 36. Both peaked at or above 160 miles per hour, with central pressures in the 910s and 20s. Both ran eye-wall replacement cycles at the top of the scale. Neither threatened land directly, and both nonetheless exported dangerous energy to distant coastlines through swell. They are not the same storm, but they are unmistakably the same performance, executed twice, on 2 stages, by the same underlying system. One storm doing this is weather, remarkable, but singular, the kind of event any active season can produce. 2 storms doing it, in the same week, in the same ocean, with mirror image intensification profiles is something else. It is the difference between a lightning strike and a pattern of strikes walking toward you, and when you widen the lens from this week to this entire year, the pattern stops being subtle at all. Part 7. Back to back. Let's pull the season's full ledger, because the 2 storms of this week are entries 4 and 5 in a list that tells its own story. Entry 1, Super Typhoon Sinlaku in April, an early season monster in the Western Pacific that did real damage in the Mariana Islands. Saipan and Tinian took a battering that residents were still cleaning up from months later. A Category 5 before the traditional heart of typhoon season had even arrived, which at the time read as an aggressive but isolated start. Entry 2 arrived in the early summer stretch, and Entry 3 removed all doubt about the season's character. Super Typhoon Bavi, which peaked with winds reported near 180 miles per hour as it bore down on Rota in the Marianas, the third Category 5 of the year, and the strongest storm on the planet until this week. An American territory of a few thousand people spent days watching one of the most violent storms in the basin's recent history aim at them. The worst of the core ultimately spared the island, but the season had announced its ceiling. Entry 4, Genevieve, first Category 5 Hurricane of the Year, Eastern Pacific, July 27th. Entry 5, Dolphin, strongest of them all, Western Pacific, July 29th into 30th. 5 Category 5 tropical cyclones, and the calendar still says July, every single one in the Pacific. And notice the distribution. This is not one freakishly active basin carrying the statistics. The Western Pacific has produced Sinlaku, Bavy, and Dolphin. The Eastern Pacific produced Genevieve and before that contributed to the early ledger. The entire ocean is participating east and west, both hemispheres of its storm-producing machinery running hot at once, while every other basin on Earth, the Atlantic, the North Indian, the postseason Southern Hemisphere, has contributed exactly nothing at this tier. Then layer on the intensity within the intensity. If Dolphin's retroactive upgrade to 175 holds, then 2026 has now produced 3 separate Pacific storms, Bavy, Dolphin, and one earlier entrant, at or above 175 mph sustained winds before the 1st of August. For calibration, many full decades do not produce 3 storms at that level across all basins combined in any single year. The seasons that did, and there are only a few candidates in the modern record, are the seasons that meteorology textbooks treat as reference extremes, the ones that get chapters written about them. We are apparently on that pace, at the halfway mark, with the climatological peak months still ahead. For calibration, here is what the planet normally produces. Averaged over the modern satellite era, Earth generates somewhere in the neighborhood of 4 to 5 Category 5 tropical cyclones per year, across all 7 basins, across all 12 months. Some years produce 1 or 2. Exceptional years push toward the high single digits, and those years are almost always remembered for it. 2026 has reached 5 by the end of July, with the Western Pacific's statistical peak, late August through October, when the basin historically produces its most and strongest storms, entirely ahead of it, and the Eastern Pacific's own peak months not far behind. If the season simply performs at historical average from here, the year lands among the most violent on record. If the back half overperforms the way the front half has, the ledger enters territory that has essentially no modern precedent. There is a second measuring stick meteorologists use that captures what raw storm counts miss, called accumulated cyclone energy, a running total that integrates every storm's intensity across its entire lifetime, so that one long-lived monster counts for more than several brief weaklings. It is the metric that separates busy-looking seasons from genuinely energetic ones. The seasons that top that ranking in the Pacific are, almost without exception, seasons that share one specific oceanic condition, the condition we are about to spend 2 full parts on. This year's Pacific is accumulating energy at a pace consistent with those benchmark years, and doing it with the highest yield months still to come. The count of 5 is dramatic. The energy behind the count is the real measurement. One honesty note on the seasonal arithmetic, since this channel flags its provisional numbers. The claim that 3 separate Pacific storms have now reached 175 mph rests partly on Dolphin's retroactive upgrade, which, as covered earlier, is reported but not yet enshrined in a final best track. If the upgrade is walked back, the ledger reads 2 at that tier plus Dolphin at 165, and the season is merely extraordinary instead of historic. Every other number in this part stands on official operational data. The shape of the story does not change either way, only the superlative sharpens or softens. The geographic clustering carries one more statistical oddity worth naming. In a typical year, the planet's Category 5 production scatters, 1 in the Atlantic, 1 or 2 in the Western Pacific, occasionally 1 in the Southern Hemisphere's summer. A single ocean monopolizing the entire top tier through July is itself unusual, and the Western Pacific's share of it is running ahead of even that basin's formidable norms. Climatologically, by the end of July, the Western Pacific has typically produced only a fraction of its season's eventual typhoon count, and its super typhoons overwhelmingly stack up in the September and October window, when ocean heat peaks and shear drops basin-wide. A West Pacific that has already logged 3 Category 5s in April through July is a basin running months ahead of its own calendar, the seasonal equivalent of record heat arriving in spring. Ahead of schedule, above the ceiling, and concentrated in one ocean. Any one of those 3 would be a footnote, All three at once is the pattern. This is why the title of tonight's video says storms, plural, and why the thumbnail says back to back. The individual storm, even a record setter like Dolphin, is not the alarming object. The alarming object is the production rate. An ocean that builds one Category 5 has had a good alignment of ingredients. An ocean that builds 5 by July, 2 of them in the same week, 3 of them past 175 miles per hour, has changed its operating point. Machines have settings. The Pacific's setting has visibly moved, and every storm this season is a readout of where it moved to. And before we go find the dial, before we open up the engine room in the next act, there is one more piece of evidence to enter into the record. It is the strangest piece, because it is not a storm at all. It is the absence of storms an entire ocean away at the precise moment the Pacific went into overdrive. Part 8. The Ocean That Won't Start. Turn your attention, briefly, to the Atlantic, the basin that owns the word hurricane in the American imagination, the one whose storms get billion-dollar names like Katrina and Harvey and Ian, the one that coastal towns from Texas to Maine spend every summer bracing against. It is silent. As of this week, the National Hurricane Center's Atlantic Outlook feed is empty. No named storm spinning, no disturbance flagged for development, formation not expected. In the climatological ramp toward August, when the basin should be stirring, when the tropical waves rolling off Africa start finding warm water and low shear and organizing into the season's first real threats, the Atlantic has yet to produce a single hurricane this year. 1 or 2 short-lived storms, strangled early, nothing more. Now hold both facts in your head at once, because together they form a diagnostic. The Pacific, 5 Category 5s, 3 storms past 175 miles per hour, 2 top-of-scale events in 3 days. The Atlantic functionally switched off. If you imagine these as independent oceans having independent seasons, the combination is a bizarre coincidence. Historic overperformance next door to historic underperformance. But they are not independent. They are plumbed into the same global circulation, and there is a well-understood mechanism that produces exactly this seesaw, this loud one-side, dead other-side signature. When the tropical Pacific warms, and we will meet the specific warming in the next part, the atmosphere above it reorganizes. Rising air over the newly warm water alters the high-altitude wind patterns streaming eastward over the Americas and into the Atlantic, and the practical result over the Atlantic's hurricane nursery is shear, hostile crosswinds at altitude that decapitate developing storms before they can stack their thunderstorms into an engine. The same warming that hands the Pacific extra fuel simultaneously raises the Atlantic's ignition threshold. 1 lever, 2 opposite outputs. The mechanism behind the seesaw has a name and a 100-year pedigree. The Walker circulation, the great east-west overturning of air along the equator. In its neutral state, trade winds blow westward across the Pacific, piling warm surface water into the western basin. Air rises over that warm pool, flows back eastward at altitude, and sinks over the cooler eastern Pacific. When the tropical Pacific warms in the pattern we will name in the next part, that circulation weakens and shifts. The rising branch migrates east, following the heat, and the whole global arrangement of rising and sinking air rearranges itself downstream. Over the tropical Atlantic, the rearrangement strengthens the westerly winds aloft, and for a developing hurricane, strong upper-level winds are lethal in a specific mechanical way. They tilt the storm's vertical stack, displacing the high-altitude exhaust from the low-altitude intake, and they ventilate the core, injecting dry, hostile air into the warm column the storm depends on. The engine never assembles. The thunderstorm clusters that would have become named storms shear apart into ragged squalls and die anonymous deaths in the central Atlantic. The historical record backs the mechanism with monotonous consistency. The Atlantic's quietest hurricane seasons in the modern era cluster overwhelmingly in years when the tropical Pacific ran warm, and the Atlantic's most catastrophic seasons cluster in the opposite state. This is, incidentally, why forecasters warn that the current silence should not be read as a season cancelled. History also contains warm Pacific years where the Atlantic snapped awake late, once conditions wobbled, and produced its damage in a compressed, vicious October. Quiet now is not immunity later. It is simply today's reading on the gauge. One caution from history belongs here, before anyone in the Atlantic's shadow relaxes. Quiet seasons do not mean quiet storms. The textbook case is 1992, a suppressed warm Pacific-influenced Atlantic season that produced barely a half-dozen named storms all year. One of them was Andrew, which reached Category 5 and leveled a swath of southern Florida in the costliest disaster the country had recorded to that point. Seasonal totals measure the basin. Catastrophe only requires one storm finding one gap in the hostile pattern. So the honest reading of this year's silent Atlantic is narrow. The ocean-wide conditions currently favour the Pacific, overwhelmingly, and the gauges agree, but a switch-down basin can still fire a single round. The professional seasonal outlook saw this coming, at least in outline. When the Pacific's warm state established itself through the spring, the major forecasting groups shifted their Atlantic outlooks toward below-normal activity, and their Pacific outlooks the other way, the standard playbook for this configuration. What the outlooks could not specify, because seasonal forecasting does not resolve individual storms, was the character of the overperformance, that the Pacific would concentrate its surplus into top-of-scale events, stacked back-to-back, arriving months ahead of the climatological peak. The direction was forecast, the violence of the expression was not. But taken as today's reading, it is remarkably clean data. 2 oceans, 1 diagnosis, 0 ambiguity about which lever got pulled. Which means the Atlantic's silence is not good news misfiled. It is the second gauge on the same instrument panel, confirming what the Pacific's violence already indicated. Both needles are pointing at the same thing. A specific, measurable, named condition in the equatorial Pacific, one this channel has been tracking for months across multiple videos, one that flipped from its opposite state to its current state faster than almost anyone forecast, and one that, according to the projections, has not finished strengthening yet. It is time to open the engine room. Part 9. The switch that flipped. The condition has a name, and if you have been watching this channel for the past month, you have heard it before, El Niño. But tonight it stops being background and becomes the main character, because the specific El Niño developing right now, its speed, its trajectory and its timing, is the single best explanation for everything you have seen in this video so far. Start with the number that defines it. Scientists track the state of the tropical Pacific through something called the Oceanic Niño Index, a running 3-month average of how far sea surface temperatures in a benchmark patch of the central equatorial Pacific, the Niño 3.4 region, have departed from their long-term normal. When that index runs at least half a degree Celsius warm for several consecutive seasons, the Pacific is officially in El Niño. When it runs half a degree cold, La Niña. The index is, quite literally, the planet's fever thermometer for its largest ocean. Here is what the thermometer has done over the past year, season by overlapping season. In the closing months of 2025, the index read -0.54, a modest La Niña, the Pacific running cool. Then the readings began to climb, -0.37, -0.14, plus 0.13, plus 0.51, across the El Niño threshold. And in the most recent reading covering April through June of 2026, plus 0.98, with the trend still pointed upward. From half a degree cold to a full degree warm, a swing of 1.52 degrees Celsius in 6 overlapping seasons. Underneath that index, the actual water temperature in the benchmark region rose from about 26 degrees Celsius to nearly 28.7, an enormous amount of added heat, when you remember it is spread across a patch of ocean thousands of miles wide. A word on how that thermometer is read, because the methodology is part of the story's credibility. The index is deliberately slow. Each value averages 3 overlapping months of data, and the official declaration of an El Niño waits for the warm anomaly to persist across consecutive seasons, precisely so that a single warm month cannot trigger a false alarm. That institutional caution is what makes the current trajectory so striking. Even the most conservative measuring instrument in climate science, one built to understate, has registered a full-blown regime change inside a year. And the ocean is only half of the measurement. The atmosphere votes too through what scientists call the Southern Oscillation, a seesaw of surface pressure between the eastern and western tropical Pacific, tracked for over a century. When the pressure pattern and the ocean temperatures shift together, coupled, the event is considered locked in. The atmosphere has accepted the ocean's new arrangement and begun reorganizing global weather around it. That coupling is present now. This is not a warm patch of water waiting to fade. It is a coupled ocean atmosphere event, feeding on itself, which is exactly what the named events of history were. The eastward slosh itself is worth picturing correctly, because it does not travel as a gentle spreading warmth. It moves in pulses, subsurface waves called Kelvin waves that race eastward along the equator beneath the surface, each one carrying a slug of warm water tens of meters thick and depressing the boundary between warm surface water and cold deep water as it passes. Ocean monitors watched pulses of exactly this kind transit the Pacific through the spring, each arrival deepening the warm layer further east. By early summer, the warm anomaly was not a film on the surface, but a thickened lens of heat extending well below it. And a thickened warm layer, as the next part will show in detail, is precisely the configuration that turns ordinary storms into this year's monsters. Climate scientists have a word for transitions like this: whiplash. The Pacific did not drift from cool to warm. It lurched, crossing from an established La Niña into an established, still strengthening El Niño inside a single year. A reversal fast enough that it has been flagged as an anomaly in its own right, and one this channel has been tracking in the data pools for months as the readings stacked up. Now, what is this thing physically? Strip away the terminology, and El Niño is about where the Pacific keeps its warmest water. In the neutral state, the trade winds blow steadily east to west along the equator, literally dragging the sun-warmed surface layer westward and piling it up around the Philippine Sea and Indonesia. That is why the Western Warm Pool exists, why the Typhoon Forge sits in the west, why the Eastern Pacific runs cool with deep water welling up along South America. El Niño is what happens when those trade winds falter. The piled-up warm water, no longer held in place, relaxes and sloshes back eastward along the equator. The warm pool spreads east. The Eastern and Central Pacific warm dramatically. The whole thermal architecture of the largest ocean on Earth rearranges itself, and the atmosphere above, which takes its marching orders from sea surface temperature, rearranges with it. You already saw what that rearrangement does to the Atlantic: shear, suppression, silence. But watch what it does to the Pacific's own storm factory, because this is the part where tonight's strangest record finally makes sense. Remember the mystery from earlier. Dolphin became the strongest typhoon on record to develop so close to the international dateline, in a region where the record books say top-tier storms do not form, because the fuel is supposed to be piled up 2,000 miles further west. Now run that expectation through an El Niño. The warm pool has spread east. The waters near the dateline, normally the cool nursery where storms are born small and mature later, are running abnormally warm. Warm enough this year to support the entire life cycle of a monster in place. Decades of published research on El Niño typhoon seasons documents exactly this signature. The average formation point of Western Pacific storms migrates east and south. Storms spend longer over open water, and the share of storms reaching extreme intensity rises, because a longer ocean crossing over warmer water means more time in the gym. Dolphin is not an exception to the climatology. Dolphin is the El Niño climatology, executed perfectly, one storm demonstrating in a single week what the pattern does statistically across whole seasons. In other words, the record that looked impossible in Part 4 is the fingerprint. Something did move the factory east. It has a name, an index value of plus 0.98, and a direction of travel, because the readings say it is still strengthening. That direction of travel is the part that turns this from explanation into forecast. Forecast guidance, and we label it clearly as forecast, not observation, has this El Niño continuing to build through the remainder of 2026, with some model projections carrying the index toward and beyond the plus 2 degree threshold that defines the rare so-called Super El Niño events, the tier occupied by the epical episodes of 1997 and 2015. Whether it gets there is genuinely uncertain. Models overshoot and undershoot these transitions all the time, and this channel will track the monthly readings as they arrive. But understand what the current reading already means. Plus 0.98 is not the peak of this event. It is the reading on the way up, and everything the Pacific has produced this July was manufactured at less than half the intensity the projections say this El Niño may eventually reach. One honest caveat rides with every projection in this part. El Niño forecasting has a known blind spot called the spring predictability barrier. Models initialized in the Northern Hemisphere, spring have historically struggled to nail the following winter's peak intensity, sometimes badly. The projections pointing toward the super tier were made across exactly that barrier. They may be overshooting. They have before. What is not a projection is the observed trajectory, 6 consecutive seasons of steady warming, coupling confirmed, plus 0.98 and rising, and this channel will put each new monthly reading on your screen the night it publishes. The switch flipped in under a year. The machine downstream of the switch is already producing back-to-back Category 5s, and yet the switch alone is not the whole engine. El Niño rearranges the Pacific's heat, but it does not create it. To understand why this El Niño has this much violence to distribute, you have to look at what has been happening underneath the surface quietly for 9 consecutive record-breaking years. Part 10. The fuel below the waterline. There is a measurement problem hiding inside every number you have heard tonight, and solving it explains this entire season better than any single storm. The problem is this: sea surface temperature. The number everyone quotes, the 86 to 94 degrees under Genevieve, the 30-degree water under Dolphin, describes only the ocean's skin. A tropical cyclone does not run on the skin. It runs on the whole warm layer beneath it, and the difference between a shallow warm layer and a deep one is the difference between a puddle of gasoline and a fuel depot. Here is the mechanism. As a cyclone spins over the ocean, its winds do more than skim heat off the surface. They churn it, physically mixing the upper ocean tens of meters down and pulling deeper water up toward the surface. If the warmth is only skin deep, the storm's own violence becomes its undoing. The churn hauls cold water up from below, the surface under the eyewall chills, the fuel line thins, and the storm throttles itself. Meteorologists watch this self-limiting brake operate all the time. It is one of the main reasons most storms stop short of their theoretical maximum. A cyclone over a shallow warm layer is a fire burning through its own oxygen. But if the warm layer runs deep, if the heat extends 50, 100, 150 meters down, the brake fails. The storm churns, and what comes up from below is more warm water. The fuel line never thins. The engine runs at redline for as long as the geography lasts. That is what the term ocean heat content measures. Not the temperature of the skin, but the total energy banked in the water column. And it is the single best predictor of which storms merely strengthen and which storms explode. Every rapid intensification event you have seen this week happened over water, where the heat ran deep. Genevieve's 30-hour doubling, Dolphin's overnight detonation, the repeaks after each eyewall replacement, each rebuild drawing on a tank the storm's own violence could not empty. Same signature, same explanation, both sides of the ocean. Now for the part of tonight's story that has nothing to do with this week, this season, or this El Niño, and everything to do with why they all hit harder than their predecessors. The world's oceans have been setting records for total stored heat every single year for 9 consecutive years. We covered this in depth in our video from July 27th, so tonight, just the shape of it. The research groups that track the top 2,000 meters of the global ocean. Dozens of scientists, dozens of institutes, multiple countries, using the global fleet of autonomous Argo floats plus satellite altimetry, reported that 2025 banked more total ocean heat than any year since modern records began, breaking the record set in 2024, which broke the record set the year before, and so on, 9 years unbroken. The ocean absorbs the overwhelming majority of the excess energy trapped by a warming atmosphere, and it has been compounding that deposit annually, invisibly, a few zettajoules at a time. And this June, the June just behind us, the global sea surface ran at record warmth for the month in independent datasets, meaning the skin of the entire world ocean has never entered a July warmer than the one that just built these storms. The scale of that banked energy resists intuition, so borrow the comparisons we walked through in detail on July 27th. The annual increase alone, just the single year's deposit, not the total, dwarfs humanity's entire yearly energy production dozens of times over. The measuring apparatus behind the number is one of the quiet triumphs of modern science. Thousands of autonomous Argo floats drifting through the world ocean, each one repeatedly diving to 2,000 meters and rising again, profiling temperature and salinity as it goes, reporting by satellite. A fleet that gives researchers, for the first time in history, a continuous X-ray of the ocean's interior rather than snapshots from ships. Cross-checked against satellite measurements of sea level, because warm water expands and a warming ocean literally rises, the independent methods agree. The ocean absorbs roughly 90% of the excess energy the planet traps. The atmosphere, for all the attention it gets, is the rounding error. The ocean is the ledger, and the ledger has posted a record 9 years straight. Forecasters have operationalized all of this, which is why none of tonight's mechanisms are exotic to the professionals. The warning centers maintain running maps of tropical cyclone heat potential, essentially fuel charts of the ocean, showing not surface temperature but the depth-integrated energy available to any storm crossing each patch of water. Analysts read those charts the way a rally driver reads pace notes. Here the fuel runs shallow, expect the storm to stumble. Here sits a deep warm eddy, brace for intensification. The charts under Genevieve's track ran hot. The charts under Dolphin's track ran hotter and abnormally far east, and the charts along Dolphin's projected path westward, toward the basin's crowded rim, show what they have shown all season. A corridor of deep fuel, continuous, with no cold water break anywhere along the route the ridge is currently drawing. Put the two layers of the story together, because this is the engine room's full schematic. El Niño is the distribution system. It decides where the Pacific's heat sits, and this year it has spread the fuel eastward across regions that are normally lean, moving the Typhoon factory toward the date line. Ocean heat content is the total inventory. It decides how much fuel exists to distribute, and the inventory has hit an all-time high 9 years running. Either one alone produces an active season. This year, for the first time in the modern instrumental record, a rapidly strengthening El Niño is drawing on the deepest reservoir of stored ocean heat ever measured. The distribution system and the inventory are both at maximum simultaneously. Every El Niño of the past, including the monsters of 1997 and 2015, ran on a shallower tank than this one. Each generation of the pattern operates on a warmer floor than the last, because between events, the ocean keeps banking heat, which means the fair comparison for this season is not what earlier El Niño years did. It is what earlier El Niño years did, plus 9 more record deposits of fuel. The June record deserves one more sentence of precision, because record has a specific meaning here. Multiple independent analyses, different research groups, different methods, different data streams, found the global ocean surface warmer this June than any June in their records, extending a stretch in which vast areas of the world ocean have been running in what scientists formally classify as marine heatwave conditions, sustained temperatures in the top percentiles of everything previously observed for the location and date. A marine heatwave is to the ocean what a land heatwave is to a city, except it does not break in a week, and everything that lives in it or draws energy from it, storms included, operates on the elevated baseline for as long as it lasts. And if you want proof that this fuel accounting actually governs outcomes, look at the one storm in tonight's story that weakened. Genevieve. She did not run out of atmosphere. She ran out of ocean. Her west-northwest track carried her off the deep, warm reservoir and onto the cooler, shallower waters of the Central Pacific, and the machine that had doubled its output in 30 hours could not even maintain itself once the tank beneath it thinned. Same storm, same physics, opposite fuel. The Pacific giveth, and the Pacific taketh away. And this year, the places where it giveth have expanded far beyond their historical borders. So what did those earlier years do? That is exactly the question the next part answers, and fair warning, the precedents are not comforting. Part 11. The Years. The Pacific went feral. Meteorology keeps a short list of Pacific seasons that professionals speak about with something like reverence, and nearly all of them share the same underlying condition this year has, a strong El Niño running under a loaded ocean. The benchmark is 1997. That year, a super El Niño, the strongest of the 20th century, with index values peaking well beyond +2, turned the Western Pacific into a production line of historic proportions. The season generated typhoon after typhoon at the highest intensities, including some of the most powerful storms of the entire satellite era, and it set the basin standard for accumulated cyclone energy that later seasons are still measured against. The same event scrambled weather planet-wide, record floods in some regions, record droughts in others, and put the term El Niño permanently into public vocabulary. When forecasters this spring watched the index begin its steep climb, 1997 was the reference case they reached for first. The second benchmark is 2015, another super El Niño, another Pacific gone feral, and this one produced the single data point most relevant to tonight. In late October of that year, in the same eastern Pacific waters where Genevieve just peaked, a storm named Patricia intensified from a tropical storm to the strongest tropical cyclone ever reliably measured in the Western Hemisphere in about a day, 215 mile/hour sustained winds, a central pressure of 872 millibars. We told Patricia's story in our video from July 27th, so here it serves one purpose. It is the demonstrated ceiling. When this specific configuration, strong El Niño, deep warm water, low shear, reaches its full expression, that is what the Pacific has proven it can build. Patricia weakened before landfall and struck a sparsely populated stretch of coast. The ceiling was demonstrated over water mercifully. The physics did not care about the mercy, it simply showed the maximum. It is worth lingering on how those benchmark seasons actually ended, because the pattern's cruelty is in its calendar. 1997's Pacific kept manufacturing violence deep into what should have been the off-season. The year closed with a super typhoon striking Guam in mid-December, months after a normal season winds down, a parting demonstration that an El Niño season does not respect the usual boundaries. The 2015 season behaved the same way. Storm after storm at the top of the scale through the autumn, records for simultaneous typhoons, the Central Pacific, usually a quiet transit zone, spinning up storms of its own in unprecedented numbers. That is the consistent signature of these years. They start early, they run hot, and they finish late. A season already historic in July by that template is not a season near its end. It is a season near its beginning, and for completeness, the 20th century offers one more data point. The El Niño of 1982 and 83, the strongest of its era, which delivered the same global scramble, Pacific storm anomalies, Atlantic suppression, weather chaos on every continent, before the modern satellite record could capture its storms in today's detail. 3 great El Niños, 3 feral Pacifics. The sample is small, as honest statistics must admit, but it is unanimous. Notice the calendar in both cases, because it is the detail with teeth for the rest of this year. The great El Niño seasons did their worst damage late. 1997's most violent stretch ran through the autumn. Patricia came in late October. That is the standard rhythm. El Niño events typically peak in the Northern Hemisphere winter, which means their storm seasons crescendo in September, October, November, the months when the pattern's oceanic and atmospheric machinery reaches full alignment. The 2026 El Niño, at plus 0.98 and climbing, is by that rhythm still early in its build. The 5 Category 5s, the back-to-back week, the dateline record, all of it has happened during the warm-up, so place this season honestly against its precedents. By late July, neither 1997 nor 2015 had assembled a resume quite like this one. 5 top-of-scale storms, 3 of them, pending that upgrade, at or beyond 175 miles per hour, 2 inside 72 hours, 1 at a formation longitude with no historical parallel. This year is running ahead of the benchmark season's pace, on a stronger fuel inventory, with the El Niño still strengthening and the climatological peak months still ahead. That sentence is the entire reason the word worried appears in tonight's title. Not because anyone can tell you where the next monster forms, seasonal forecasting cannot do that, but because the 2 most violent Pacific seasons in living memory are the closest analogues to the one we are currently inside, and we are tracking ahead of both of them at the halfway mark. What do the analogues actually predict, mechanically, for the months ahead? 3 things, none of them exotic. First, an eastern and central Pacific that stays busy beyond its normal season. 2015 famously drove the Central Pacific, the quiet middle of the ocean around Hawaii, to unprecedented storm counts, and this year's configuration warms exactly those waters. Second, a western Pacific whose late-season storms form further east and track longer over open water, arriving at the Asian rim bigger and stronger than the climatological average storm. The Dolphin profile, repeated. Third, a northern hemisphere autumn in which the usual seasonal wind down arrives late or barely arrives at all. None of that is a prophecy. All of it is simply what this pattern did the last 2 times it reached full strength, adjusted nowhere for the fact that the current version is running on the deepest fuel reserve ever measured. History does not repeat on demand, and honest analysis requires saying so. Seasons can stall, El Niño projections can bust, and an ocean that looks primed in July can go quiet in September. It has happened. But the betting line drawn by the precedents runs one direction, and every gauge this channel monitors, the index, the heat content, the ledger, the silent Atlantic, is currently sitting on the same side of it. The benchmark years also left a legacy worth naming, because it explains the machinery watching Dolphin tonight. The shocks of 1997 and 2015 drove a generation of investment across the Pacific Rim. Denser satellite coverage, upgraded warning centers, the very heat potential charts and microwave constellations this video has leaned on all night. The system watching this season is, in a real sense, the system those seasons built. What no amount of investment changed is the underlying asymmetry. The tools see the storms better than ever, and the ocean builds them faster than ever, and the race between those two trends is precisely the race this season keeps staging. There is also a sting in the tail of the analog years that honesty requires flagging now, in July. Great El Niños tend to collapse into their opposite. Both benchmark events were followed within a year by strong La Niña rebounds, and the rebound years brought their own, different catastrophes, the suppressed basins snapping back with interest. Whatever this season ultimately does, the pattern's history says 2027 is already loaded with the counterstroke. Which brings us to the question that actually matters for the next 2 weeks, the one every forecast office from Guam to Tokyo is quietly working through tonight. The engine has built its strongest storm of the year, and that storm is still out there, rebuilding itself over open water. Where does it go? Part 12. Where the stored power goes. Every tropical cyclone is a passenger. For all its violence, a storm like Dolphin does not choose its path. It is carried, steered by the winds of the larger atmosphere around it, the way a leaf is steered by a river. To know where the year's strongest storm is going, you do not study the storm, you study the river. The river in this case is a vast dome of high pressure called the subtropical ridge, a semi-permanent mountain of warm, sinking air that sprawls across the western Pacific at altitude, usually centered somewhere between Japan and Hawaii. Air flows clockwise around its perimeter. A typhoon south of the ridge gets carried westward along its underside. A typhoon reaching the ridge's western flank gets swept north, then northeast, recurving out to sea. The ridge is the single most important object in Western Pacific forecasting, because its shape, where it ends, where it weakens, where a passing trough carves a notch in it, decides which coastlines every storm visits. Forecasters speak of it the way sailors speak of a coastline. The ridge builds, the ridge breaks down, the ridge extends. Every typhoon track map you have ever seen is really a portrait of the ridge, drawn in storm paths. Right now, the ridge is holding firm to Dolphin's north, and so the storm is doing the only thing physics permits, sliding west, northwest along the ridge's southern flank at about 10 knots, deeper into the open Pacific, away from Wake Island and toward nothing in particular. The official guidance keeps it on that heading for roughly the next 3 days. After that, the guidance bends the track more due west, the ridge extending, the corridor continuing, and this is where the honest uncertainty begins, because a storm travelling west along that corridor for a week arrives, eventually at the Western Pacific's crowded rim. Extended range guidance, and this is a possibility we flag in exactly those words, not a prediction, sketches a potential approach toward Japan in roughly a week, in the first days of August. The operative words are potential and approach. At 7 days range, track forecasts carry error measured in many hundreds of miles. The difference between a storm recurving harmlessly east of Honshu and a storm threading toward the home islands is a modest change in the ridge that has not happened yet and may never happen. Both scenarios are alive tonight. Anyone who tells you confidently which one wins is ahead of the data, including for the record this channel. But here is what makes the watch window real rather than hypothetical, and it is the synthesis of everything tonight. First, intensity. The question of what Dolphin will be in a week is inseparable from the eyewall cycles we covered in Part 5. Each rebuild over this abnormally warm, abnormally deep fuel supply resets the storm's clock. The El Niño configuration that let it explode near the dateline extends the favourable water westward along its entire projected path. There is no cold water waiting to disarm this storm anytime soon. The corridor ahead is fueled. Second, size. Every replacement cycle broadens the wind field, and a storm that spends a week cycling across the open Pacific tends to arrive at the far end enormous. Third, the season's own track record. This is the 5th top-of-scale storm of a year that has repeatedly outrun its forecasts on the high side. Some numbers on that uncertainty, so the watch window has honest error bars. Modern track forecasting is genuinely good at short range. Average errors at 24 hours are down to a few tens of miles, an achievement decades in the making. But the error grows relentlessly with lead time. By day 5, Average track errors run around 200 miles. By day 7, the historical average climbs toward 350 miles or more, and individual busts run far larger. 350 miles is the difference between Tokyo and open ocean. That is why forecasters draw cones rather than lines, and why tonight's honest statement about Dolphin's future is a fan of possibilities that only narrows as the ridge commits. The fan narrows fast, though. Each day of model runs that agree removes hundreds of miles of coastline from the question. By this weekend, the picture will be far sharper than it is tonight. Climatology adds its own context to the window. Early August is squarely within the season when the Western Pacific's ridge historically extends far enough west to steer typhoons toward East Asia, rather than letting them recurve harmlessly. The corridor toward Japan, Korea and China is at its most open in exactly the weeks Dolphin is now entering. Most typhoons, across the full record, eventually recurve into the open North Pacific and die anonymously in cold water. The minority that do not are the ones steered by exactly the kind of firm, westward extended ridge the current pattern features. Nothing about that guarantees an approach. Everything about it explains why the forecast offices along that rim have already opened their long-range watch on this storm. And if the Japan scenario did tighten, the compounding mechanism deserves to be understood precisely rather than vaguely feared. The immediate threat a typhoon brings to earthquake-struck terrain is not primarily wind. It is water on wounded ground. Kyushu's slopes have just been shaken by a magnitude 7 class earthquake and its ongoing aftershocks. Soil that has been destabilized, fractured and loosened sheds rainfall differently, and the landslide thresholds that normally require extreme rainfall drop substantially on freshly shaken hillsides. Japan's own disaster history includes exactly this sequence: earthquake, then typhoon rains, then the slope failures that neither event would have produced alone. Emergency planners there know that history better than anyone on Earth. It is why even a brushing past by a weakened dolphin would be treated, in Kyushu specifically, as a serious event, and why the ridge forecast over the next 5 days is being read in Japanese operation centers with an attention that has nothing to do with curiosity. For everyone else along the rim, the practical stakes are more ordinary but not trivial. A super typhoon crossing the Western Pacific closes shipping lanes, reroutes the Trans-Pacific Air Corridor, and sends its long-period swell onto coastlines from the Marianas to the Philippines days ahead of any wind. The broadcast has already begun. Mariners' charts across the basin carry Dolphin's projected wave field this week, regardless of where the center ultimately goes. And there is a human dimension to the timing that this channel will simply note plainly. Japan is closing out one of the hardest weeks it has had in years. The country is still in the active aftershock window of the devastating Kumamoto earthquake that struck on July 28th, a disaster we covered in detail in our videos from earlier this week, with hundreds of thousands of people displaced or on alert in Kyushu and emergency services fully committed. The possibility that the strongest storm on the planet arrives at the edge of that same country within 10 days of that earthquake is exactly the kind of compounding scenario emergency planners wargame and hope never to see. It is not the likeliest outcome. It does not need to be likely to be worth watching with full attention. So here is the honest watch list for the next several days, the same one the professionals are using. Watch the ridge. The moment the global models agree on where its western edge sets up in early August, the track fan collapses and the question answers itself. Watch the microwave passes. Each eyewall cycle Dolphin completes or fails to complete sets the intensity it carries west. Watch the official agencies, the warning centers that own this forecast, as the storm crosses into the ranges where their advisories grow specific. This channel will be doing all three, nightly. It is worth describing the good outcome too, because it is entirely real and entirely possible. The ridge erodes, a passing trough in the westerlies carves a gap, and Dolphin takes the exit, recurving north and then northeast into the empty mid-latitude Pacific, where cold water and hostile shear dismantle it over a few days, and the strongest storm of 2026 ends its life as a nameless swirl of clouds bothering a few container ships. Most typhoons end exactly that way. The entire question of the next week is whether Dolphin joins the majority. The answer will arrive incrementally. Warning center advisories every 6 hours, global model cycles 4 times a day, each run either widening the exit or narrowing it, and by early next week the fan of futures will have collapsed to 1, because the engine built the storm and the ridge will spend it somewhere. An ocean that has already broken its own records 5 times this year is now holding its strongest creation in open water, refueling it while the steering pattern decides. That is not a sentence designed to frighten you. It is simply where the physics stands tonight. What it is designed to do is raise the real question, the one the title promised. If the professionals are not worried about this track this week, what exactly are they worried about? Part 13. What the experts are actually worried about. Strip away the headlines and ask the professionals directly what keeps them up at night about a season like this, and the answer is almost never the storm currently on the map. It is a scenario, and the scenario has a name in every forecast office on the Pacific Rim: rapid intensification near a coastline. Everything this season has demonstrated over open water, the 30-hour doublings, the overnight category jumps, the re-peaks after every eyewall cycle, is survivable theatre as long as it happens 800 miles from the nearest person. The same physics, executed within the final day before landfall, is the deadliest failure mode in tropical meteorology. Not because the wind is different, but because the warning is. Evacuations are planned against the forecast, not against the storm. A population told on Tuesday evening to expect a Category 1 does Tuesday evening things. Shutters, maybe, groceries, a decision to stay. If the ocean then does to that storm what it did to Genevieve and Dolphin this week, Wednesday morning arrives with a Category 5 inside the forecast blind spot, and millions of people committed to decisions made against a storm that no longer exists. This is not a hypothetical. We told the full story in our video from July 27th, so tonight it needs only its outline, because it is the case every worried expert is quietly citing. October 2023. Hurricane Otis approached Acapulco, a metropolitan area of roughly 1 million people, with official forecasts less than a day out calling for a strong tropical storm, perhaps a Category 1 at landfall. Every model showed modest strengthening. Instead, Otis found a deep pocket of abnormally warm water and added on the order of 115 miles per hour of wind speed in its final 24 hours, striking the city at full Category 5 intensity in the dark, with winds around 165 miles per hour. At least 52 people died. The damage ran into the tens of billions of dollars, the costliest disaster in Mexico's recorded history. And the forecasters revised their guidance only after reconnaissance aircraft flew into the storm that evening and found something the satellites and models had entirely missed. The official post-analysis was unsparing. Essentially every simulation had failed, and the failure was discovered hours before landfall, far too late to move a city. Now connect Otis to this week, because the connection is the worry. Otis was one storm finding one warm pocket. 2026 has turned the warm pocket into the default state of the largest ocean on Earth. The rapid intensification profile that made Otis a catastrophe, the profile forecasters treat as the hard case, the one the models still cannot reliably see coming, has now been executed twice in 1 week, casually, by 2 different storms in 2 different basins. When the researchers whose work we covered on July 27th documented that intensification rates near coastlines have been climbing for decades, that the share of storms making their biggest jumps in their final approach is growing as the nearshore waters warm, they were describing, in the language of peer review, exactly the scenario this season keeps rehearsing over open water. Every rehearsal has been harmless so far. The worry, stated plainly, is that the season's next rehearsal happens inside the forecast blind spot of a coastline with a population on it. Layer onto that the measurement problem this very storm just demonstrated. Dolphin's peak intensity was revised upward after the fact. The real-time estimate, produced by the best analysts in the world using the best satellite methods in the world, ran a category of violence behind reality, and nobody knew until the reanalysis. Over open ocean, that gap is academic. Compress the same gap into a landfall timeline and it is operational. The storm that is stronger than anyone's screen says it is, approaching a coast on a forecast that inherits the underestimate. The Western Pacific has no reconnaissance aircraft to close that gap. The satellite estimate is the only estimate. The professionals know both of these things simultaneously, which is precisely why the calm in their public language coexists with the urgency in their internal one. And then there is the structural worry, the one that outlasts this season. The map itself is expanding. Dolphin just demonstrated that top-of-scale intensity is now achievable in a region of the Pacific where the historical record contains nothing comparable, which means the coastlines that plan against that record are planning against an ocean that no longer exists. Every seawall height, Every evacuation zone, every building code on the Pacific Rim encodes assumptions about where monsters form, how fast they strengthen, and how much warning physics will allow. Those assumptions were actuarially sound for the 20th century's ocean. The 2026 year of this century keeps issuing corrections. Further east, faster, earlier in the year, closer together. Institutions adapt on decadal timescales. The baseline is moving faster than that. The gap between the two, between the playbook and the ocean, is the thing the experts are actually worried about, because that gap is where casualties come from. The reconnaissance gap deserves to be stated as starkly as the professionals state it privately. In the Atlantic, when a storm threatens land, Hurricane Hunter aircraft fly directly into the core, dropping instrument packages through the eye wall, measuring the actual winds at flight level and the actual pressure at the surface, feeding ground truth into the models within hours. That capability is the single biggest reason Atlantic intensity forecasts outperform Pacific ones. In the Western Pacific, the basin with the strongest storms on Earth and the largest exposed populations, no such flights have been routine since 1987. Every number for Dolphin, from its birth to its retroactively corrected peak, is an estimate from orbit. The most typhoon-threatened coastlines on the planet receive, structurally, the least verified intensity data in the tropical world. That is a policy inheritance from a different era's budget decisions, and every analyst who worked this week's upgrade knows exactly what it implies for the August scenario nobody wants. And the geography of exposure turns that data gap into a stakes multiplier. The Western Pacific Rim is where typhoons and megacities share an ocean. Tokyo and Osaka, Shanghai and Shenzhen, Manila, Taipei, Hong Kong, Seoul, a corridor holding hundreds of millions of people, the densest concentration of typhoon-exposed population and infrastructure on Earth, much of it on low-lying deltas and reclaimed coastal land. The economic arithmetic scales the same way. A single major landfall on that corridor moves global supply chains, shipping indexes, and insurance markets within days. When the intensification physics gets faster, while the verification stays satellite only, the risk does not add across that geography. It compounds. The field is not standing still, in fairness, and the worried experts would want that said too. Intensity models have improved measurably over the past decade. Machine learning forecast systems have begun matching and sometimes beating the traditional physics models on track. New satellite constellations are shrinking the gaps between microwave passes. The tools are getting better every single year. The professionals' worry is not that progress has stopped. It is that the ocean is currently improving faster than the tools, and this July has been the cleanest demonstration of that gap in years. To feel why lead time is the whole game, run the evacuation arithmetic that emergency managers live by. Moving a large coastal population is a logistics operation measured in days, not hours. Warnings have to cascade through official channels, transport has to surge, roads have to carry multiples of their designed load, and the last, least mobile fraction of the population, the elderly, the hospitalized, the carless, always takes the longest. Planners generally want evacuation decisions made on the order of 48 to 72 hours before conditions arrive, which means they are acting on forecasts made at exactly the range where intensity error is largest. Every hour of warning lost to a late-intensity surprise is not an abstraction. It is a specific number of people who do not get out. The great successes of modern warning, the mass evacuations that turned potential 1,000-fatality landfalls into double-digit tolls across Asia's typhoon coasts in recent decades, were all built on forecasts that held. Rapid intensification near shore is the specific mechanism that breaks them. There is also a version of this worry scaled to a single household, and it is worth saying directly to anyone watching from a typhoon or hurricane coast. The practical lesson of this season is not fear, it is margin. If the storms now strengthen faster than the forecast can track, then the old habit of waiting for the upgraded warning before acting has quietly become more dangerous. The upgrade may arrive after the window. The adjustment is undramatic. Know your evacuation zone before the season asks. Treat a nearby Category 1 the way last decade treated a Category 3, and build your timeline off the watch, not the warning. The ocean has shortened the fuse. The only variable a household controls is how early it starts. The season's arithmetic sharpens all of it. Everything you have watched tonight happened in July, on an El Niño at less than half its projected strength, before the basin's statistical peak. August, September and October The months that produced the great catastrophes of the benchmark years are still ahead, with the fuel inventory at record depth and the distribution system still ramping. The experts are not worried because something might go wrong. They are worried because the system is performing exactly to specification. The specification keeps escalating, and the highest output months are still in front of us. Which leaves one last piece of the story, because while the professionals worry about forecast blind spots and moving baselines, a very different set of explanations for this season has been spreading online, and some of those deserve a real answer. Part 14. The questions. Everyone is asking. Whenever the ocean does something without precedent, two things happen in parallel. Scientists write papers, and the internet writes theories. This channel's standing policy is to take the theories seriously enough to actually check them, because dismissing questions breeds distrust, and because the honest answers are usually more interesting than the theories anyway. So here are the 4 claims circulating most widely about this season, examined properly. Claim 1. The storms are being manufactured or steered. Weather modification at scale. This one resurfaces after every extreme storm, and it notably exploded after Otis in 2023, where the identical claim was formally investigated by fact-checkers and found baseless. The physics is the short answer. A mature tropical cyclone releases heat energy at a rate hundreds of times the entire electrical generating capacity of human civilization, continuously, for days. Humanity possesses no instrument, no array, no program that operates within orders of magnitude of that budget. Our most ambitious real-world weather intervention, cloud seeding, nudges precipitation from individual clouds by modest percentages and remains scientifically contested even at that scale. Steering is even further out of reach. A typhoon is moved by continent-sized pressure systems, and redirecting one would require rearranging the atmosphere over a hemisphere. And the observational record closes the case. Dolphin and Genevieve intensified under continuous independent surveillance by satellite fleets belonging to multiple nations, whose agencies cross-check one another's data hourly. A secret program would need every one of them, in several rival countries complicit simultaneously. The dull truth is worse than the theory. Nobody is driving. That is the unsettling part. Claim 2. There is a Category 6, and it is being suppressed. The suspicion here is at least built on a real observation. Storms do keep exceeding the scale's top tier by enormous margins. But the premise misunderstands the scale. Saffir-Simpson is open-ended by design. Category 5 means 157 miles per hour or more with no ceiling, so no storm can ever be off the scale and no number needs hiding. Patricia's 215 mile per hour peak in 2015 was published in real time, entered the record books in full, and is cited in every textbook, the opposite of suppression. There is in fact a live scientific debate conducted openly in published journals about whether a Category 6 should be added precisely because storms at the extreme keep clustering further above the threshold. That is science doing the reverse of hiding. If anything, tonight's story shows the system's bias runs toward understatement in real time and correction afterward. Dolphin was upgraded publicly the moment the analysts concluded the operational number ran low. Claim 3, the ocean data is exaggerated. The records aren't real. Walk the chain of custody. The heat content record rests on thousands of autonomous floats, built and deployed by dozens of nations, whose raw profiles are publicly available to anyone. The analyses are performed independently by separate research groups on separate continents, using different methods, and published through peer review. The results are cross-validated against physically independent measurements, satellite altimetry, reading the sea level rise that warming water must produce by simple thermal expansion. For the records to be exaggerated, every group, every method, every instrument, and the physics of expanding seawater would all have to be wrong in the same direction by the same amount, year after year, without a single defector or discrepancy. Independent replication is precisely the thing conspiracies cannot survive. 9 consecutive record years is not a claim by an institution. It is a convergence of instruments. Claim 4, the newest one, born this morning. The retroactive upgrade proves the agencies manipulate the numbers. This gets the machinery exactly backward. Best track reanalysis, the process that produced the 175 figure, is a routine, documented, decades-old practice that exists because real-time satellite estimation carries known uncertainty. The revisions run in both directions. Storms get marked down as often as up. Entire historical eras have been reassessed, and each change ships with its published reasoning. An agency quietly revising itself in public, with its work shown, is not manipulation. It is the definition of transparency, and the alternative, freezing the first guess forever to avoid the appearance of change, would corrupt the climate record the theories claim to defend. The perennial named suspect deserves its specific paragraph. HAARP, the high-frequency research facility in Alaska that anchors half these theories. The facility is real, its purpose is public. It heats small patches of the ionosphere, the charged layer beginning about 60 kilometers up, to study radio propagation, and its transmitter runs at a few megawatts, roughly the output of a small wind farm. A tropical cyclone's heat engine runs at a scale trillions of times larger, in a different layer of the atmosphere, powered by a different energy source, with no physical coupling between the two. Blaming an ionospheric radio experiment for a typhoon is, energetically, blaming a flashlight for a forest fire, and the facility's operating logs, like the storm data, are public. It is worth being gentle about why these theories flourish, because the impulse behind them is not stupidity. It is pattern hunger in the face of fear, and this channel's audience knows that impulse well. It is why we check the sun every night. When the ocean does something with no precedent in living memory, someone did this, is a more emotionally manageable story than the baseline moved. The first story has a villain who could theoretically be stopped. The second has physics, which cannot be argued with, only prepared for. Choosing the second story anyway, checking it, quantifying it, watching it nightly, is the harder discipline, and it is the entire reason this channel exists. And for viewers who want to hold the receipts themselves, every instrument in tonight's story publishes openly. The storm advisories, the index readings, the float profiles, the alert feeds, all of it is public, free, and checkable by anyone with a browser. Distrust the narrators if you like. The data belongs to everyone. There is one more alternative explanation worth ruling out, not because it trends online, but because this channel checks it every night on principle: the sun. It is a fair instinct. When Earth's weather turns violent, ask whether our star is misbehaving. The answer this week is a flat no. The space weather picture through this entire stretch has been quiet. No geomagnetic storms, no significant Earth-directed eruptions, solar activity idling at levels that could not plausibly stir a teacup, let alone an ocean. Whatever built this season, it was not built 93 million miles away. It was built in the water by the mechanisms you have spent this video inside. A switched-on El Niño, running on 9 record years of banked heat, expressing itself through the 2 most violent machines the atmosphere knows how to make. And that is the honest, fully checked answer to the question everyone is asking, which means it is time to say the quiet part plainly. The comfort of the conspiracy theories, every one of them, is that somebody is in control, someone steering, someone hiding, someone inflating. The evidence says no one is steering. The ocean has simply moved to a new operating point. The machines it builds are performing to the new specification, and the season's most productive months are still ahead. 2 Category 5s in 3 days was not the finale. On the pattern's own precedence, it was the overture. So here is what Project Nightwatch is watching as the lights go down tonight. The next microwave pass over Dolphin, which will show whether the third peak is underway. The Friday intensity window, where the circulating forecasts and the official guidance part ways. 170 versus 185. The monthly index reading, and whether plus 0.98 keeps climbing toward the super threshold. But above all of it, one question, the one the Ridge will answer within days and the one we will be here nightly to track. The strongest storm on Earth this year is rebuilding itself over open water right now, with a fueled corridor ahead of it and a steering pattern still deciding. So when the Pacific finally chooses where to spend what it has built, will the map that gets drawn be the one from the record books or the one this season keeps rewriting? That question does not have an answer yet. The water is still deciding, and the watch continues.